It was mid-December, and the weather across Scotland was atrocious. I had been working a short-term contract at an engineering firm up in Aberdeen and desperately wanted to get back down to my family in Inverness for Christmas. The trains were completely dead due to frozen tracks, so my only option was a late evening flight on a tiny, twin-turboprop aircraft operated by a regional budget airline. There were barely 10 passengers on board that night. Because the plane was so small, there was no solid door separating the tiny cabin from the cockpit, just a faded gray curtain that the pilots hadn't bothered to pull shut. Sitting in the second row, I had a direct view right down the central aisle and out through the cockpit's massive front windscreen. We took off into a howling gale. By the time we were halfway through the short flight, the cabin air felt freezing, and the twin engines were screaming against a violent crosswind. The captain's voice crackled over the PA system, remarkably flat and emotionless. He informed us that our destination, Inverness, was experiencing a severe blizzard and visibility was dropping rapidly. Worse still, our primary diversion airport, Aberdeen, had just shut its runway due to ice. We had enough fuel for one solid attempt at landing in Inverness, and that was it. As we began our final descent, the aircraft started moving in ways that felt deeply unnatural. It wasn't just standard turbulence, it felt as though some massive, unseen weight was violently shoving the tail section from side to side. I gripped the plastic armrests until my knuckles turned stark white. Through the front windscreen, I could see both pilots hunched forward, their bodies tense, desperately fighting the control yokes. Outside the side windows, there was nothing but a blinding, dizzying swirl of white out of the blackness that we descended for what felt like hours. My chest tightened as I kept waiting for the sudden bump of the wheels meeting the tarmac. But the descent just kept dragging on. Suddenly, the faint, blurry amber glow of the runway approach lights sliced through the thick curtain of snow. The plane was swaying so violently that the lights would flash out of the left window, then swing wildly over to the right window a second later. We were barely 100 feet above the deck, lining up with the center line, when the landing lights illuminated something directly ahead. My breath caught in my throat. Standing precisely in the middle of the runway, facing the descending aircraft, was a tall, solitary figure. It was dressed entirely in a dark, oversized hooded coat, completely motionless despite the ferocious, freezing winds. It didn't move, didn't panic, and didn't try to run. It simply stood there, staring directly into the blinding landing lights of the incoming plane. "There's someone on the..." I tried to shout, but the words caught in my throat. At that exact microsecond, the aircraft slammed onto the tarmac with a deafening crash. My forehead violently struck the seatback in front of me, and an overhead locker burst open, spilling coats into the aisle. The engines roared into reverse thrust as the pilots slammed on the brakes, the plane fishtailing dangerously on the slick ice before finally grinding to a halt near the very end of the runway. The cabin fell completely silent, save for the heavy breathing of the terrified passengers. The captain came over the radio, his voice noticeably shaken as he welcomed us to Inverness. I unbuckled my seatbelt immediately and walked up to the open cockpit door. The first officer was staring blankly at his instruments, his hands still trembling slightly. "Did you see him?" I whispered, leaning in. "The person standing on the runway?" The first officer looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely hollow. He didn't say a word for several seconds, then simply muttered that the ground crew was going to check. 10 minutes later, the captain returned after inspecting the exterior of the plane with a heavy torch. His face was bright red from the biting cold. He looked at me and shook his head, explaining that the airfield security team had just driven the entire length of the runway in a patrol vehicle. There wasn't a single scratch on the aircraft, no signs of impact, and absolutely no footprints left behind in the fresh, heavy snow. He told me that under extreme stress and blinding weather, the human brain often invents familiar shapes out of the chaos. But I knew what I saw. As we finally taxied toward the small, dimly lit terminal, I pressed my face against the cold window glass and looked back out into the dark expanse of the airfield. Way down at the far end of the runway, right where the wheels had first made impact, a tiny, single point of light was swaying slowly back and forth in the darkness. It wasn't an airfield marker. It was moving, walking slowly away into the freezing Scottish night. The most terrifying monsters don't wear monstrous faces, they wear tailored suits, order a gin and tonic, and sit exactly 2 rows behind you. It was late November in 1974, a miserable, rain-slicked Wednesday afternoon at Manchester Airport. I was 25 at the time, working a tedious administrative desk job in Leeds, and I had booked a short domestic flight up to Newcastle to see my parents for the long weekend. The ticket cost me just a few pounds, and I was assigned seat 14B on a Hawker Siddeley Trident, a distinct British airliner that featured a set of passenger stairs built directly into the rear tail section. The flight was quiet, with only about 30 passengers scattered throughout the cabin. Just before the cabin doors closed, a man caught my eye as he walked down the aisle. He was dressed in a pristine, dark wool suit with a crisp white shirt, but what drew my attention were his heavy, dark sunglasses. It was a bleak, overcast British afternoon, making the eyewear look entirely out of place, but I shrugged it off, assuming he was a wealthy businessman or perhaps a minor local celebrity. He carried a small, hard-shelled leather briefcase and sat down quietly a few rows behind me. We took off into the heavy gray clouds on schedule. I opened a paperback thriller I had bought at the terminal station and tried to lose myself in the text. About 20 minutes into the flight, I noticed one of the flight attendants walking briskly up the aisle toward the front galley. Her face had gone completely pale, and her lips were pressed into a tight, thin line. She entered the cockpit and didn't emerge for a very long time. Shortly after, the captain's voice came over the speaker system. His tone was perfectly calm, carrying that classic, reassuring British pilot authority. He informed us that due to a minor technical scheduling issue and poor weather visibility over Newcastle, we would be entering a holding pattern and circling for a short while. We circled. And circled. For nearly 2 agonizing hours, the aircraft simply flew in massive, slow geometric loops over the grey countryside. The atmosphere inside the cabin slowly began to sour. Passengers were whispering anxiously to one another, checking their watches, and glancing toward the windows. I looked back at the man in the dark sunglasses. He hadn't moved an inch. He sat perfectly upright, completely relaxed, nursing a small drink from the trolley. The terrifying calmness radiating from him made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When the plane finally began its steep descent, it became clear we weren't landing at Newcastle. We touched down in total darkness at a remote, deactivated military airfield somewhere in Yorkshire. The plane taxied far away from the main hangars, coming to a halt on a completely isolated stretch of tarmac surrounded by nothing but empty fields and a line of police vehicles with their blue lights flashing silently. The captain came back over the PA. His calm veneer was gone, replaced by a tense, strained quietness. He instructed everyone to remain exactly where they were, keep their hands visible, and follow instructions carefully. That was the moment the cold reality of the situation finally settled over the cabin. A woman across the aisle began to weep softly into her handkerchief. Through the cabin window, I watched a solitary figure in a yellow high-visibility jacket approach the rear stairs of the aircraft. He handed a heavy, canvas mail sack to the lead flight attendant, who then walked it directly down the aisle and handed it to the quiet man in the sunglasses. A moment later, the front doors opened, and the police instructed the passengers to evacuate immediately, one row at a time. I moved as fast as my legs could carry me, keeping my eyes fixed entirely on the exit door. The moment my boots hit the cold, damp tarmac outside, I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for hours. During the frantic police briefings inside the airfield building later that night, the full horror of what had occurred was finally revealed to us. The elegant man sitting just behind me had handed the flight attendant a typed note shortly after takeoff. He claimed his leather briefcase was packed with military-grade explosives wired to a manual detonator. He demanded £50,000 in cash, 2 custom parachutes, and a fully fueled aircraft. While I had been casually turning the pages of my fiction book, a real-life nightmare had been sitting mere feet behind me, holding the lives of 30 people in his hands. But the detail that still keeps me awake at night happened after we were safely off the plane. The hijacker ordered the flight crew to take off once more, forcing them to fly low and slow through the pitch-black storm clouds toward the English Channel. Somewhere over the desolate, freezing expanses of the North York moors, he forced open the rear tail stairs, strapped the cash to his chest, and vanished out into the freezing, rain-lashed night sky. They never found his body, and they never found the parachute. He simply dissolved into the British fog, leaving nothing behind but an empty seat and a cold, lingering dread. The absolute worst mistake you can ever make in life is ignoring your own gut instinct just to save yourself a bit of extra paperwork. For nearly 15 years, I worked the graveyard shift as a mobile security guard at the long-stay park-and-ride lot just outside Birmingham International Airport. The job itself was incredibly monotonous. You spend 12 hours a night driving a battered old Ford Ranger pickup truck up and down endless gravel roads, using a digital handheld scanner to log the registration plates of vehicles left behind by holidaymakers. I had my routine completely down to a science. I knew exactly which sodium streetlights flickered when the wind picked up, I knew which corners of the lot would flood during a heavy British downpour, and I knew exactly how to smack the dashboard of the truck to get the heater working when the frost settled in January. It was during one of those freezing, biting January nights in 2021 that I first noticed the vehicle. It was a dark gray, high-spec Land Rover Defender parked near the back of row G. When I aimed my digital scanner at its rear plate, the screen froze completely, displaying a loading icon before crashing entirely. Annoyed and eager to get back to my warm cabin for a tea break, I simply scribbled the registration number down on my paper clipboard and drove off. A week later, a heavy blanket of snow fell across the West Midlands. Driving past row G, I noticed that while every other car in the lot looked like a thick, white block of ice, the Land Rover's windows had been partially cleared of frost, and the snow on the bonnet looked slightly disturbed, as if someone had recently brushed it away. I pulled up alongside it, got out, and touched the metal bonnet with my gloved hand. It wasn't warm, per se, but it lacked that deep, biting coldness that a stationary car should have had after a week in sub-zero temperatures. I assumed the owner had returned briefly to fetch something, so I got back in my truck and moved on. By the time the busy spring holiday rush arrived, the Land Rover had completely faded from my mind. In April, I happened to pull up my digital log records and noticed something incredibly bizarre. The Land Rover in row G had been successfully scanned and logged into the system almost every single night for the past 3 months, and many of those logs were registered directly under my unique staff badge number. The terrifying thing was, I knew for an absolute fact that I hadn't scanned that car since January. I immediately rang up the main dispatch office and spoke to the veteran controller, a woman who had worked at the airport for decades. She brushed it off instantly, telling me the software was ancient and frequently cached old data to fill in missing gaps. I didn't want to cause trouble or look incompetent, so I let it drop. By early June, the weather turned uncharacteristically hot. That was when the smell first started. It began as a faint, sickeningly sweet odor wafting through the humid night air whenever I drove down the back perimeter fence. At first, I convinced myself it was just a dead fox or a badger that had crawled into the nearby brambles to die. But as the summer weeks dragged on, the stench grew so thick and foul that the shuttle bus drivers were actively making jokes about it over the communal radio channels. The Land Rover's windscreen was now completely covered in a thick layer of yellow parking warning notices and weathered flyers. One quiet evening in August, the local news broadcast ran a prominent missing person segment. A family man from a nearby town in Warwickshire had vanished without a trace back in early January. When they flashed his picture and his vehicle details on the screen, my blood turned to ice. It was the exact registration plate of the Land Rover in row G. The police arrived an hour later. I stood back in the pouring rain, watching the flashing blue emergency lights illuminate the back of the car park. The forensic team eventually had to smash the heavy glass of the driver's side window to gain entry. The post-mortem report later confirmed that the poor man had suffered a catastrophic, fatal heart attack within mere minutes of parking his car in January, well before he could even open the door or gather his luggage. The detail that haunts me to this very day isn't the graphic state of the vehicle or the grim reality of what was inside. It's the memory of that freezing January night when I touched the bonnet. I had invented a logical, comfortable excuse for why the car felt different, and for 8 straight months, every single time a red flag appeared or the computer system glitched, I actively chose to look away just to avoid the hassle of a complicated report. I learned firsthand how easily the human mind will ignore absolute horror, simply because pretending everything is normal is so much easier than facing the truth.